Alright, excuse me. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of Psychology 810. We are going to discuss some theories in the area of cognitive and language development today. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. Everybody seemed to have no problem, or at least no significant problem, turning in introduction papers and the first article for the class, which is good. And so I will assume that we're all good to go as far as the turning in of materials. I do still plan on posting a video, ideally today, that will show you how I want your papers written as far as APA formatting goes. If you feel comfortable with your own APA formatting and you feel like you don't necessarily need to watch another video, you can do that. Understand that if you have had me in class before, you will know that I'm a little bit of a nitpick when it comes to APA formatting. I do excuse a few small mistakes here and there, but ultimately I think it'll be beneficial to go ahead and wait for the video. And yeah, so I think that should be it as far as housekeeping is concerned. Nothing major that I can think of happening in the current realm of the current sphere. So let's go and get started. All right, so one of the things that is always sort of widely interesting or discussed is the concept of nature versus nurture. This is one of those topics that I feel like if you are ever at like a party or with a bunch of quote unquote intellectuals, you may or may not hear them. Sometimes you'll hear them discussing the finer aspects of why they think that it's nature versus nurture, or or somewhere there in between. But ultimately, the research is pretty clear that we all understand that it's both nature and nurture. I think that there's probably an example for every student in this class that can give that can show you that I was born to the same parents as my sister, and she is living a wildly different life than I am as far as education is concerned, and we had the same nature, presumably, and actually we had very similar nurture growing up, but ultimately the outcomes were much different. So I think that there is a lot to be said about both nature and nurture, obviously, and there's some pretty controversial research out there that makes the argument that researchers can predict at about age 3 whether or not a student will graduate from, or whether or not a child, because they're not a student at that point, a child will graduate from high school. So that's 15 years in the future, and there's been some research that has made the argument that they can predict it all the way back to age 3. And a lot of that has to do with both nature and nurture, right? If you are in a house that does not, have a whole lot of books, a whole lot of learning materials, a whole lot of emphasis on education, then that will be detrimental for the child ultimately. And then it's not hard for any of us to imagine that children that are born into maybe more affluent schools, sort of the quote unquote silver spoon in their mouth, better neighborhood, better school district, they have a higher likelihood of success. Now, is that to say they have that the individual that has the opposite upbringing of sort of a student that has a more impoverished upbringing will not succeed? That's obviously not true. We have so many examples. And if any of you are fans of sports, you can always see individuals that have gone on to be very successful in their life, and they came from not the best background, right? If you look at Venus and Serena Williams, they lived in Compton, California for a while, which is not at all a great neighborhood or a great school district, and they lived there for a short amount of time, and they are obviously very, very successful. Richard Sherman is a football player for the 49ers now. He used to be on the Seattle Seahawks. He's with the Niners now, and they're going to go play in the Super Bowl this weekend. He came from Compton as well. So ultimately, I think that it's important to really understand that when we're working with our students in the schools, it does not necessarily matter if they came from a very affluent background or if they came from a much more difficult background. Obviously, the individual that lived in the nicer house and in the nicer school district and probably has a higher ability to afford a nice college, they have a better chance. But ultimately, there's a lot to say that anybody can have a shot at success. Okay. Alright, so the first theory that we're going to discuss today is Bronfenbrenner's theory of development, and his theory is it's really important to educators because of the fact that it should remind us as educators that we have to consider the environment whenever we're working with students, right? So if you are working in a higher needs, low SES, low socioeconomic status, high free and reduced lunch school district, then it's going to take extra work to help get those students the same opportunities that it would be for an individual that is going to an affluent school district, right? If you are, if you have a student that, maybe they are, I will avoid that topic for now, and we'll discuss that here in a few weeks, but I'll avoid it for today. But you have to remember that you as the teacher or you as the educator, you are the person, you are the group of people that the child is going to see the most, aside from mom and dad. And honestly, sometimes you are the person they're going to see the most, no matter, regardless of mom or dad. I had students whenever I was working in a high school actually, every high school I worked at had situations where parents were working 2-3 jobs on any given day to make ends meet, and so their kid was going home and just hanging out by themselves, or going in and hanging out with friends, and so understand that you as an educator will have a significant amount of influence on these kids, and Bronfenbrenner's theory of development is a fantastic model that should remind you of that, because right there in the mesosystem, and if you look at the diagram right there, it shows that in the mesosystem there's only a few things that are included there. Home is one of them, right? So the place where they sleep, ideally. Church is another one. Neighborhood, and then school, right? And so those are incredibly important to a child's development. And I'm assuming at this point we're all in Psych 810, which is Ed Psych. We all want to be educators. We all want to work in the schools and help students. And so it's important to consider the importance of your role as an educator. Now, one weakness of this model is it doesn't necessarily incorporate, actually doesn't incorporate at all, not necessarily, it doesn't incorporate at all cognitive development. So it it errs heavily on the side of bioecological development, or social development, but it does not include a whole lot of. It doesn't include. I keep trying to use more wishy-washy terms, but it doesn't include at all any influence on the area of cognitive development, which obviously is a concern, right? It is a weakness that must be included, and that is why it's important, as we're discussing these, to not just ascribe to one particular model, but ascribe to multiple. So this is just a quick scenario that I have come across in my own life, and it just gives you an example of sort of the different scenarios, situations that students can be faced with. And these are two actual students. I changed the names for their safety, for their privacy, but they are both real individuals that I know in my own personal life. I have not worked with both of them. One of them is a family member of mine, and the other one is a student that I worked with whenever I was in Denver, Colorado. So, I think that these are two very, very different scenarios. Obviously, there are two different situations, but it's important just to consider one of these students, a little bit of extra work will be needed to help him overcome the trials that he is facing in his life. And in fact, this was, I worked with a student about 4 or 5 years ago, and I mean, he was a part of a legal case in Denver because of his struggling, and it was pretty tough to hear about. And then the other student, with a little bit of extra work, to get it, one could make the argument that Cole does not need extra support to get to where John will get if he has that extra support, which is tough. But it's important for us to know that and for us to consider that, because one day we will all be in the schools and we will be faced with a John, and we will need to be able to support that student and to understand that student needs more than if you were dealing with Cole. Okay, and I think that that's pretty intuitive, but when you're in the schools and certain situations happen, it is hard to remind yourself of that. Okay, and it's hard to remind yourself that John needs that extra support, because sometimes John, let's be honest, John was not always the nicest person to his teachers. He was often very rude to his teachers, but and that led to his teachers not really wanting to help him, not really seeing the benefit of helping him. But there's a lot of reasons why he was being that way, and so he had to go through a lot of counseling eventually. And so it's important to remember that, and to remember that whenever you have a student that is telling you to F off, the best thing for you to do is just breathe, and as I'm breathing myself, and just give that student some room to mess up, and have and you be willing to still help him, which is easier said than done. All right. So neuroscience, obviously we're discussing cognitive development, and you can't really discuss cognitive development without discussing some neuroscience here. So neuroscience at its basic concept is the study of the brain, spinal cord, nervous system, and sensory organs, and the nerves. And so this is our nervous system, right? So if you are interested in the area of neuroscience, then you are going to be fascinated by synapses and how our brain sends information from our brain to our heart, or from our brain to our hands, because it is that interaction and that relationship between, you know, sort of what is up here and, you know, what's happening right here is, you know, often taken for granted until you run across individuals. When my grandfather was diagnosed with Parkinson's, you know, it was one of those things where he always sort of took for granted the power of his brain and the importance of neuroscience in his own daily life until he was in a situation where his brain was not working. It wasn't sending information the way that it should. You know, and so one of the interesting parts about the brain is this concept of neuroplasticity. And so neuroplasticity is essentially our brain's ability to recover, our brain's ability to adjust with the changes in the environment. And one of the most interesting examples that I've heard about this, or I've seen recently, there is a series on, I want to say Netflix. I believe it's Netflix, and it's I think it might be called Diagnosed, if I remember correctly. It's been a few weeks since I watched it, but ultimately what it discusses is giving very hard cases the appropriate or proper diagnoses. And one of the examples that they gave that was very interesting was this little girl who she had a seizure disorder, and she was about 8 or 9 years old, and she was so severely impacted by these seizures that she was excuse me, that the doctors were actually considering severing the corpus callosum, the sort of the connection between the two hemispheres of the brain. And the reason for doing that would be because in children with this disease, they can sever the corpus callosum, and it can actually improve their seizures, their symptoms of seizures. Now, the reason I found this interesting was because they discussed how traumatic it would be for her at 8 or 9 years old, but they discussed how children with the same disorder and the same prognosis at about 1 or 2 years old are often given the same surgery and can lead, you know, close to normal lives, because our brain has an amazing ability to recover. Now, the ability to recover does change. So the rate of ability, if you will, it does change as we get older. But there has been research that has found that even in up in the later adulthood ages, individuals show signs of neuroplasticity, where our brains are able to change, our brains are able to recover. And one of the cool parts about that is that you can have it's sort of that concept of you can't teach an old dog new tricks, which has been widely debunked because of neuroplasticity and the fact that it still takes place. We still have this concept of neuroplasticity later on in life, which is pretty cool. One con of it is that whenever you are a young child, your brain is easily molded. Your brain is easily adjusted to your experiences, right? The neuroplasticity of brain for my 1-year-old daughter is her brain is incredibly malleable, right? And so children that are born into really difficult situations can have situations that can negatively impact their brain for the rest of their life, right? Now there obviously is some ability for the child's brain to recover and to rebound, but ultimately, there is a lot of research out there that negative impacts early on in life can have some really negative consequences for the rest of a child's life, because neuroplasticity does allow these negative experiences to rewire our brains, and not always in the best way. So here's a little bit more about the physiology of our brains. There's a picture of a synapse, and one of the interesting parts of sort of neuroscience is looking at the composition of our brains as we get older. Whenever we are young children, we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of neurons, right? We have a ton of neurons, and we can still regenerate neurons, but you see this really interesting concept when you look at sort of the changing structures of brains, where our brains actually prune synapses that are not needed anymore. For me, unfortunately, it is the skill to do a lot of things, but one of the ones that I was most aware of was I was a big music guy whenever I was in high school and college. I was in marching band for most of my college career. I absolutely love marching band. It is a lot of fun, and I was a pretty good tuba and trombone player whenever I was younger. I was not the best by any stretch of the imagination. I was not going to be on any stages, playing for any philharmonics or symphony orchestras, but I was decent. And one day, about a year or two ago, I told myself I wanted to pick the trombone back up, and so I did. I went and I picked up my trombone. I went and rented a trombone from a place out in Sacramento, California, and I am nowhere near as good as I was back in the day, and that is because that is a skill that that required some cognitive load, and at some point my brain determined that those synapses, that those neurons were better used for other purposes, right? So those neurons were pruned, and my brain was rewired in a way that would give me more focus on other things, like psychology, like working in the schools, like helping students. But the cool part again about neuroplasticity is as I pick up my trombone, I do find that I'm getting a little bit better about my trombone, or with my trombone. It just takes practice, right? It takes rewiring of those neurons, which is a pretty interesting concept. Makeup of the brain. The cerebral cortex is what makes up about 85% of our weight. And really, the one thing I want to harp on the most on the slide, as you might see from my use of capitals and exclamation points, is the importance of the prefrontal cortex, right? So the prefrontal cortex is this little bitty portion of our brain right about here, right here. And this portion of our brain is what is responsible, takes up a lot of the responsibility when it comes to planning, maintaining attention, behavior control, emotional control. A lot of these characteristics that tend to get a lot of middle schoolers and high schoolers into a lot of trouble. Inhibition is not a skill that you normally attribute to a high schooler, which is it can get them in a lot of trouble, right? I know for myself, whenever I was 17, 18 years old, I was, for lack of a better term, I was foolish. I was an idiot. I did things that I really shouldn't have done, and could have gotten me into a lot of trouble. but thankfully they didn't, and I'm here today. But ultimately, this is a portion of our brain that does not fully develop until around 25 years of age. So if you are under 25, then your brain is still trying to develop your prefrontal cortex. Now, you can absolutely scream at your screen right now and tell me that you're very mature and tell me that you are able to maintain attention and reasoning and all these fantastic things, and maybe you are. I'm not sitting here making the argument that you're not, but the argument that I'm making is that very, very soon you'll be working with students that are not able to do these things, right? 15 years old, 16 years old, they're not going to be able to function the way that a grown adult does. And but also consider the severity of consequences. Right, so when you're working in the schools, students are going to get in trouble. They're going to get into situations that put them in that put them at risk of sort of lifelong consequences, right? Legal trouble, whatever it might be, and understand whenever you are possibly asked to advocate for a student, the importance of the prefrontal cortex and lack thereof of the prefrontal cortex when it comes to these students. All right. A few neuromyths. I'm not going to go on too much about these, but ultimately the most important myth that I can convey to you is that learning styles is a myth. As a teacher, it is your job to reach all of your students. And the best way to reach all of your students is to use as many formats as possible. There is a reason why you are currently watching a video with a PowerPoint, right? So, and there's a reason that whenever I was in college, I would take lots of notes because for me, myself, I would watch these videos and I would listen to this lecture, which would be both visual and oral processing or auditory processing. And I even knew that that wasn't enough for me. I required even more, so I would take notes because the act of me listening and then writing it down would help me do a better job of processing information and storing it away in sort of long-term resources. And there are a few other myths that I think are very beneficial here. The main one we discussed just a minute ago was we cannot gain new brain cells. It's obviously a myth. And then the myth that men's brains are better suited for certain things than women's brains. No, that's also been debunked quite a bit. Okay. So the next theory we're going to discuss is Piaget's theory of cognitive development, and this is one of the more famous sort of stage theories of development, and this is the most famous cognitive theory of cognitive development. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I am recording about half an hour right now, but ultimately it just gives us details on where our brains are, as our brains are developing, what they are able to do. Okay, so you can see that birth to 2 years of age, infant able to organize activities in relation to their environment, all the way to the formal operations of 11 years and plus. And it's important to consider that a lot of this work was done, decades and decades ago, right? So the understanding of our brain and what our brain is capable of doing has changed considerably since Piaget was doing his work, right? So excuse me. It's important to consider as you look at sort of neo-Piagetian theories and more recent cognitive advances, that really this was a jumping off point. This was what started a lot of the work that is being done in in the area of cognitive development. So the qualities of of Piaget's theory ultimately is that our world is made up of external experiences, and our brain is constantly trying to find equilibrium. Equilibrium is essentially the comfort. Our brain is trying to be comfortable in the world around us, and in order for our brain to be comfortable, our brain essentially works very, very fast at getting rid of or avoiding situations of ambiguity, and will try to consider as little information as possible to categorize information into different schemas. Schemas are just different categories of the world, and sort of the easiest ones to think of are just good, bad, right? So from a evolutionary standpoint, you can think of sort of early humans or pre-humans. They were in a world where they had to be able to judge very quickly on whether or not walking into a certain situation would kill them or not. If they walked into an area where there were a lot of dangers, then they might die, right? So they had to categorize situations very, very quickly, very efficiently, and use that to survive. And so now fast forward to today, our brains are still hardwired in a way where we like habit, we like consistency, we like situations to fall into a neat and tidy world for ourselves, which obviously is not always the case, but that is what we like. And so essentially we do our best once we have developed these schemas. We do our best to categorize this world into these schemas as much as possible. And this comes down to assimilation and accommodation. So I gave this example here, which you can absolutely read, but ultimately it comes down to this day and age, we really like to categorize people into different political schemas, and if you come across an individual who is like-minded, then I'll just read the example. I watch a very particular cable news channel and know that those that don't agree with what they spout on that channel are whiny babies. Yesterday, I met somebody that watches the other news channel, and they were a whiny baby. This situation assimilated into my current schemes, because my current schemes is that the individual that watches the news channel that I don't watch, they are all whiny babies. And here is an individual who watches the other news channel, and they're all whiny babies. So hey, this one fits right in. This individual fits perfectly into my scheme, my current processing, my current schemes. Unfortunately, the other day or today, I met somebody who watched my same news channel, my same beloved news channel, and they were kind of whiny. And so I had to now accommodate that experience and develop a new scheme to account for this whiny baby who was watching the same news channel as me. Unfortunately, I feel like that can apply on either end of the spectrum, whether you watch cable news channel A or cable news channel B. Ultimately, that is relevant to either one of you, unfortunately. And so that is an opportunity for you to understand that schemas can be very, very complicated and can be constantly changing, or hopefully should be constantly changing. Cool, I just hurt my elbow. So the benefit of using Piaget's theory in the classroom is provides providing concrete experiences. So we want to provide concrete experiences for our students when it comes to learning. The one that I always go back to is if you are a history teacher and you're teaching sort of Civil War era history, I really can't think of a better location than Kansas or Missouri to be one of those teachers, because you have so many different concrete experiences that you can give your students. You can take your students to the massacre site that is off of Highway 69 between Pittsburgh and Kansas City, and where essentially one of the main skirmishes, or one of the main incidents that really sparked the tensions, really escalated the tensions between Missouri and Kansas at the time, and who knows how much of an impact it had leading to the Civil War. And then using social interaction. So social interaction is incredibly important. And I don't know if I don't think I discussed this at all earlier, but social interaction is one of those things that you'll find states and you'll find health departments really encouraging you to be socially interactive with your child, because as we interact with our children socially, their brain is able to accommodate these experiences, right? And so so social interaction is incredibly important, because it provides our brains opportunities to grow, to learn, and to figure out and to better understand the world, right? And then it provides opportunities for women, especially for young children. Social interaction with young children actually increases their likelihood of having adequate language skills, language development, which is incredibly important for all of our kids, right? So there are some benefits to Piaget's theory in the classroom, and I think we'll discuss as we go through the semester some more fine-tuned opportunities to use Piaget's theory in the classroom, but ultimately these are some of the broad sweeps. And Vygotsky's sociocultural theory of cognitive development. I think this is a great theory that does incorporate both social interaction and culture, and how it impacts the growing mind, right? So we had Bronfenbrenner's theory of cognitive development, or theory of development, which excluded cognitive functioning or cognitive development. And then we had Piaget's theory of cognitive development, which did include some social interaction, but ultimately Vygotsky's theory is much more centered on the impact of social interaction on an individual's cognitive development. And so ultimately, development is the result of internalization, which is incorporating external society-based ideas into individual cognitive structures, which is just to say that as we are going through our world and as we are sort of having these new experiences, then our brains are learning, just the same way that we discussed just a minute ago on how our brains are working to accommodate or assimilate. Our brains are constantly growing and are constantly trying to learn from the external world. But this is, I guess, the novel inclusion of Vygotsky's sociocultural theory is culture, right? And social, and the importance of social language. So yeah, and it incorporates the importance of language and how language can be used to increase the development of our brains, especially those of us that and those individuals that are very young. Like my daughter, who is 1 year old, I try to talk to her as much as possible in very sort of very concrete language terms, because of the fact that the more that she hears this voice, unfortunately, she can only hear this voice and my wife's voice. My wife's voice is much better than mine, obviously. I'll stop digging myself into a hole right now. But ultimately, when she hears this voice, it is giving her opportunities to learn and to understand what speech is. And it's one of those things that as you see children in the world, you'll see children that are, my wife has a cousin who lives out in Washington, and this one has 8 or 9 kids, and everybody acknowledges that essentially the development of the 7th and 8th kid have been stunted considerably because nobody talks to these children. Everybody's too busy taking care of 8 children to actually talk, to actually interact with these children, which can be very detrimental to a child's development. And as we are working in the schools, it is important to consider the theory of zone of proximal development, which is Vygotskian, and ultimately the argument here within zone of proximal development is that we need to have some we need to put information and instruction in terms that make sense to a child, right? So essentially giving them enough information, enough base knowledge to understand certain topics, so scaffolding, right? And you want to make sure the scaffold, that the spaces between the particular scaffolds are easy enough to overcome for a child, right? So you don't want to walk into a first grade classroom where first graders have very little understanding of science in general and start discussing astrophysics, right? That won't benefit our children whatsoever. And ultimately what you want to do is, in any situation, whether it's science or history or math or whatever it might be, you're providing baby steps. You're providing steps for children to learn. In math, if you are in a 4th grade classroom where they're learning, double-digit multiplication, the last thing you're going to do is introduce algebraic terms as x or y, and so it's just important to understand the baseline of where your students are and what you need to do to get them from their baseline to where you expect them to be at the end of the year. And this can be very, very difficult, especially when you're at your younger ages. I know that whenever I was working in California, a lot of school teachers were having difficulty with their students because students would come into kindergarten with varying levels of understanding of reading, right? So some kids came in and were able to read sort of basic texts, when other kids came in and didn't know what a book was, right? They had never encountered a book. So they are, so unfortunately you as an educator have to take into account the baseline of these students and help them get from where they are of not understanding where books, what a book is and what text is, to the point where they are, ideally able to read basic text. So it can be frustrating and it can be difficult, and it can vary considerably depending on what grade you're in and what your experiences are. So one of the important components of using Vygotsky's theory in your classroom is to always embed information into culturally relevant experiences, right? So I think this is another one of those concepts that has become more intuitive as we've learned more about what helps students become successful. And you hear about a lot more schools that are trying to have sort of culturally relevant instruction or culturally sensitive instruction. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the instruction that has been taking place in our schools for decades was designed to support one individual's a certain individual, right? And that individual typically looked like me, sort of a male wasp, if you will. And really, our schools are becoming much, much more culturally diverse, and so we need to be able to incorporate a student's diversity and a student's culture into the instruction. And if we do that, then it will be more relevant to them and they'll be more engaged. And also providing scaffolding opportunities to help learners sort of bridge the knowledge gap between them and their peers. And then language development. Here's a little bit of information about the language development, but I'm sitting at about 45 minutes right now. So for our discussion topic this week, we will discuss language development in the age of technology. So is technology interfering with language development? That is the question that will be discussed in our discussion for this week. And in order to, I know that some of you have found the discussion topic in the files. I guess I didn't realize that it was in there. But ultimately, what I want you to do, so make sure you're watching this video, making sure you're watching the entirety of the video, is I want you to go and Google random color generator. Now, the first search result should be something along the lines of random.org. Click on it. It will come up with a result. It'll come up with a little square that has a color in it, and that color will have, inside of it will have a symbol. Depending on how old you are, that symbol will either be a hashtag or a pound symbol, depending on if you were born in the 80s and before, or you're born in the 90s and after. But anyway, so it'll have either a hashtag or a pound symbol. They're the exact same thing. And then some letters, a random string of letters and numbers. Okay, so what I want you to do is to Google random color generator. And the first search result should be random.org, something from random.org. Click on it. Don't do anything else. It will automatically pop up with a random color for you. And in that color will have a string of letters and numbers. I want the string of letters and numbers. You can include the hashtag if you want, or the pound symbol if you want. You can include that if you would like to. You don't have to. It is up to you. What I want are the letters and the numbers. Okay? All right. Again, if you have any questions or concerns, so essentially what I want is the code from the random color generator. Enter your post. Okay? Pretty simple. And that will give me some indication that you have been watching this video. Okay? All right. Any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out. I will ideally be posting a video very soon about the APA formatting of the papers. All right. If you have any questions or concerns, reach out, email, please, always email me. All right. Thanks so much. Bye.